Hi everyone, good morning. I'm gonna start my little timer as well so I can keep track. I could talk about oceans for hours, so I have to keep myself within constraints. So I just got introduced, so I'll just go right into it. And I will also say my contact information will also be at the end of the presentation. I also have business cards. If anyone is interested, you're more than welcome to follow up. So I was asked to cover, as I guess everyone was, biological impacts, economic impacts, climate change adaptation and mitigation. And I figured I'd just keep it nice and straightforward and go through those in turn. So when we think about our oceans, there are obviously a lot of biological impacts to climate change. There are both a lot of non-biologic impacts as well. So a lot of changes to ocean conditions, ocean chemistry. Our oceans are changing at an extremely rapid pace right now. We are seeing increases in ocean temperature, sea surface temperature. We're seeing changes in ocean pH. We're seeing changes in wave energy, wave strength, sea level, tidal events. And so those have a lot of impacts both on the human communities that exist along our shores, as well as the species living in the ocean. So the examples here, that's water temperature from a buoy off the Oregon coast that I took from one of our ocean observing systems. It's just an example of how warm our oceans are, how unseasonably warm our oceans are getting. That impacts not only which species are able to thrive, but when they're there, where they are, how deep they might be. And that other picture is a picture of a halibut. We get halibuts here in Oregon. They're one of my favorite fish to eat. Highly recommend trying them if you haven't. But each year we're seeing, oftentimes we're getting fewer. They're deeper. Halibut are really cold water fish. And so it's just an example of how changing ocean conditions are also changing the species we're seeing, where we're seeing them, and how large they're getting. Our halibut are getting smaller, they're going deeper, we're seeing fewer of them. And that has implications not only for, say, our fishing community, and I'll talk about a number of different species and how they're being impacted. But this is just an example because as we see changes to our marine communities, the animal communities, that impacts not only, say, the human communities that depend on them, but it changes the entire trophic webs of our environments. We're seeing large predator species move out, new predators move in, and so there's a lot of cascading impacts where entire food chains are being reorganized and marine communities are trying to refigure out or reestablish how they're interacting with one another. In addition, as I mentioned, we're seeing changes to ocean pH. At the end, I'll talk a little bit when I'm talking about adaptation and mitigation, why we're seeing so much ocean change and what we can do about it. But the reality is the oceans absorb, depending on which scientific paper you read, 25 to 35% of the atmospheric carbon we have. And so as we continue to put more carbon into the atmosphere, the ocean has absorbed a large percentage of that. It's one of the reasons we haven't seen temperatures increase as rapidly as we originally thought they would. And the reason our oceans are able to take up so much carbon is because of phytoplankton, very, very microscopic plant organisms. And they can uptake a lot of that carbon, but we reach a point where our oceans are essentially saturated. There's a lot of scientific evidence that we might be reaching that saturation point, which essentially means that our oceans will stop uptaking the excess carbon we have in the environment or in the atmosphere, and rates of global change, rates of global warming will increase because we're seeing less of that go into the oceans. It also means that we're putting a lot of carbon into the ocean, and all that carbon has to go somewhere. And what that ends up doing, it's a chemical reaction I'm not going to get into right now because I only have 20 minutes, but it changes the overall pH of the ocean, and so lowers the pH, and we end up with what we call ocean acidification. For most organisms, that might have a very, very minimal impact, but for our organisms that build shells, it can be very, very detrimental early on in their life stages. And so this is just an example of oysters, and then on the other side, Dungeness crab. As you might know, we love Dungeness crab in Oregon. It's very, very economically important, and unfortunately, at its larval stage, it's susceptible to ocean acidification. As Dungeness crab get larger, and they're full grown, they have normal shells, it's less of an impact. But if they don't make it to that adult stage because they're being negatively impacted in their larval stage, that's obviously a huge concern, both for our oceans, the health of our oceans, and the health of our communities that depend on natural resources like fisheries. And so for a lot of our shellfish, these changing ocean conditions are having immediate impacts that we're already seeing. So we're also seeing a lot of economic impacts from our changing climate. Some of that is, to our coastal communities, and some of it in ways that we never actually anticipated. So for example, I'll start with the picture on the left there. That's a picture. I live out on the coast, just in between Newport and Lincoln City, in a little tiny town. This is a picture from my back deck from 2020, September of 2020, when we had the large fires out on the coast. Unprecedented. We haven't had fires of that scale. They reached about 3 miles away from my house, and for several days, skies were red, smoke everywhere, you couldn't go outside. So the coastal communities are being impacted, both from the inland, the terrestrial side, as well as obviously from the ocean side. I mentioned we're seeing changes in wave strength and tidal action. Our king tides oftentimes are becoming stronger. The mean high water line is becoming higher. And part of this means when we have these major storm events, which we've always had, we're having them more frequently, and they're happening closer to shore, they're hitting higher on our coastlines. And we're seeing a lot of areas with very, very significant erosion, coastal erosion, where entire communities, houses are, sliding down towards the ocean, areas where you had houses set back 25, 40 feet from the cliffside. Now they're 10 feet from the cliffside and getting increasingly worried. So we're seeing a lot of activity happening and a lot of erosion happening along our coastlines. So those are just some of the changes to the ocean and changes to the environment due to climate change that are impacting coastal communities. But obviously our fisheries are also very, very heavily impacted. And because these oral presentations are going to look at resource-dependent communities and impacts to natural resources, I wanted to spend a little bit of extra time talking about fisheries. So these are some numbers from 2021, and these are what's called ex-vessel value. What that means is when a fishing boat pulls into port and they sell their product to the processor, this is how much money they're bringing in locally. It's before it gets processed and resold. It's before it gets sold by seafood markets. It's not taking into account the value of tourism or boat repair or any of the other secondary economic benefits that we get from our fishing community. This is literally just that very first order value. And so, for example, in Newport, Oregon, which is where I work, in 2021, just the ex-vessel value of our fishing community brought in about $74.4 million. Newport's a pretty small town. That's a sizable amount of our annual income right there. And that's true for a lot of our fishing communities. That's true in Charleston. It's true in places like Brookings, where these communities only really exist because of fishing. Fishing is the primary dominant source of income. And even if you're not only the fishing itself, but like I said, all of those secondary impacts, the seafood restaurants, the tourism, the gear repair, the boat shops, things like that, they're all intricately tied to fishing. And if we lose our fisheries, we lose those sources of income. So these are just some of our major Oregon fisheries. We've got Dungeness crab, albacore tuna, pink shrimp, a whole lot of species that are just basically called groundfish. And all of them are being impacted in different ways. Some fish are getting smaller, some fish are going further north, some fish are going deeper, some fish are existing further out. For some of them, the seasons are shifting, where we see them earlier, we see them later. Some of them are being impacted at the larval stages, like I said, so that we're worried that we won't have as many to catch in the future. And all of those changes impact the fishing communities. If the fish are further out, the boats are using more fuel, which not only is more expensive and drives up the cost of seafood, but also ends up putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Our boats are all diesel-based at this point. And so there's a lot of continuing compounding impacts from these changes to the ocean that are impacting not only the fish themselves, but the people that are dependent on the fish. I also do some work in aquaculture. And so the species that are being represented here for aquaculture, that's dulse. Has anyone ever had dulse? Yeah? It's a trendy new product. I say new, it's been a couple years, but people are very excited about it. A lot more people getting into dulse production. So we've got the dulse there, and then the oysters as well. We don't have a lot of aquaculture in Oregon. Where I work, we're not even supposed to say the word aquaculture. But the reality is we have a little bit, and it's either shore-based seaweeds, which is what dulse is. Dulse is a red seaweed. It's grown on shore in tanks. Supposedly it tastes like bacon. I don't know that I actually agree with that, but it is really, really good if you deep fry it. And then oysters, we also are growing, oysters are the dominant aquaculture product economically for Oregon, and obviously they are being heavily impacted by climate change because of things like ocean acidification. Go ahead. Okay. But there's a bright side to the oyster story and the aquaculture story, which I'll get into as I talk about mitigation efforts. I just wanted to really briefly mention, because what I do is work on social ecological systems, so I look at how human systems and environmental systems kind of coexist and operate as a whole, and any sort of change to that entire system, any sort of change to a part of that system changes the entire system. And so I've already highlighted this, but I really wanted to put some of these pieces together. Shifting fish stocks, obviously, so we have climate change, changing our oceans, changing oceanographic conditions, so chemical conditions. Because of that, I always like to say fish are really, really bad about respecting borders. They don't care where they're supposed to be. They don't care where they've always been. They go wherever they want. And as we see changing ocean conditions, fish, marine species in general, which are adapted to certain temperatures, certain salinities, certain oxygen levels, if that changes where they are, they'll go to find the conditions they want. And so because of that, we're seeing a lot of changes in species composition, marine communities through shifting fish stocks. That ends up changing fishermen behavior. It changes fishing communities, human communities, and it changes infrastructure that's much more difficult to update, like processors. We see changes to processors. Suddenly we have new species, different species, fewer species. That affects a lot of our seasonal workers, our migrant workers, so that's impacting entire coastal communities. We're seeing a lot of land use impacts thanks to climate change, and like I mentioned, sea level rise and coastal erosion. And then we're seeing a lot of changing demographics as fishing becomes more difficult and more expensive. We're seeing changes to our coastal communities where the seafood processors and the fishermen are either being priced out of neighborhoods because they can no longer compete with how much money they're spending on fuel and things like that. And so we're really seeing a lot of demographic shifts along our coastline. So you take something like climate change and you play it out, and you end up with entire communities that used to be resource-based and now are tourism-based or something like that. There are some, there's always going to be winners and losers when you see things like this happening, changes in the ocean. And so I just wanted to use one quick example to highlight how these things work together. So this is a picture of a market squid. I really like this particular picture. Market squid are beautiful animals. They're really, really pretty. They're about 1 foot long. They're also known as calamari. If you've ever had calamari, you've had market squid. Market squid is a California fishery. It's a very profitable, economically viable fishery in California. We've always intermittently had market squid off the coast of Oregon, usually in El Nino years, or following El Nino events when our waters were warmer. However, since we had the blob, I don't know how many of you remember the blob, a giant hot patch off the ocean in around 2015 timeframe, coupled with an El Nino event, we had market squid basically move into Oregon, and they've never really left. And so even though we always had them, say every 10 years or so, we've had them every year since 2016, other than 2017, no one's really sure why. But every year since then, we've had market squid off the coast of Oregon, to the point where it's actually become an Oregon fishery. We're starting to see Oregon market squid vessels, and it is good. It's a good fishery, but also raises a lot of new questions. How are we going to manage them? Who's going to have access to the fishery? Is it going to be an open fishery? Or are we going to create a quota system? So there's a lot of rippling effects in terms of management, who's going to be allowed to access the fishery, and also what do we do in terms of infrastructure? Right now we don't have a single processing plant in all of Oregon that can process market squid. So we catch it here, and then we take it all down to California to process. And so, these changes in the ocean environment have a lot of larger scale ramifications for managers, for fishing communities, for processors, things like that are worth exploring. So I'll just wrap up with a couple of things in regards to adaptation and mitigation. There's not a whole lot we can do to change what's happening in the ocean other than stop producing CO2. However, there are things we can do on a local level, and so I'll talk about those. This is just an example in terms of adaptation. I've already mentioned some of the adaptation that our fishing communities have to do, going further, going deeper, changing gear, changing species. For our coastal community, adaptation oftentimes looks at protecting the coastline. And there's kind of two ways you can do that. You can do man-made armoring, you can do natural armoring. And the reality is natural armoring, which is planting dune grasses and other species to stabilize the coastline, is much better for everyone, the environment, communities, coastlines. It's longer term, much more effective. Lots of different species can live in these, but it's also more expensive, and it takes a lot longer to work. And so you end up with the hard armoring, where people create rock walls, seawalls, and it protects their property, but it pushes that wave energy to either side of that seawall and ends up impacting the community, the houses and communities on either side. So we don't actually have a really effective, inexpensive, near-term solution, but people are working on it. There's a lot of people working on that. There's also biological things we're doing. We're coming up with new policies to help address the shifts in the fisheries. And we have programs like the molluscan broodstock program at Oregon State University that's actually selectively breeding oysters that are more resilient to changes in ocean acidification. And then finally, mitigation. Again, there's not a whole lot we can do. The oceans are already doing a lot to mitigate climate change, but there are little things we can do to tweak it and help out, especially at the local level. One of those is things like eelgrass beds. At a local level, eelgrass beds are really, really good for drawing in and sequestering more carbon and reducing acidification at a local level. Additionally, you can do things like seaweed farming, which is currently not legal in Oregon, but a lot of people are working on making it legal. There's things you can do with just ecosystem restoration. The healthier an ecosystem is, the more carbon it can bring in, the more carbon it can sequester. Oysters and other shellfish actually are also really good for helping to keep our estuaries and bays healthy. They're filter feeders, they keep things clean, and they help seagrasses and other things thrive. So at a local level, maintaining habitats, maintaining eelgrass, maintaining macroalgae, things like that actually can be really good for keeping local conditions healthy. Protecting coral reefs and other natural structures in the water can help to mitigate storm impacts and things like that. Like I said, dune restoration is really important for protecting our shorelines. So there's a lot we can do at the local level to help reduce the impacts of climate change. So I think that's my time. So again, my contact information, I have business cards, and you can reach out to me at any time, and I'm happy to talk more.